So the first role that Grenada played was in training soldiers. Then in 1862, in the fall of 1862, there was a great battle at Corinth, Mississippi. The Confederate forces were defeated and they retreated to the Holly Springs, Abbeville area and concentrated around Abbeville. And General U.S. Grant, who was the federal commander, was up in Tennessee, and he was going to make his attack down the Mississippi Central Railroad against Abbeville. There was a flank attack from Helena, Arkansas over to the west of here, and Confederate cavalry under Colonel John Griffith, Texas troops, ran into those soldiers around Oakland, Mississippi. They fought a 2 or 3 hour battle at Oakland. Both sides then retreated, but by then the Confederates at Abbeville realized that their supply line was in danger, and they retreated to Grenada. The last battle on that retreat was fought at Coffeyville, just about 12 miles from here, and that was on December the 5th, 1862. So the Confederate forces went into their new defense line at Grenada, and it stretched from Graysport on the east all the way to what is now Holcomb on the west. The town of Holcomb did not exist then. It was called Tuscahoma Ferry. It was just a small Indian village there. But the entire length of the Yallabusha between Graysport and Holcomb had to be defended. Grenada was the central part of that line. And General Grant knew that virtually the entire Confederate Army in Mississippi was down at Grenada, and he was coming down from the Abbeville area where he had conquered the Confederates there, forced them to retreat. And his ultimate goal was to reduce Vicksburg. And since most of the army was actually up here, the decisive battle for Vicksburg was going to be fought on the banks of the Yallabusha River. Well, that same Texas cavalry colonel, John Griffith, who had fought at Oakland, went to General Pemberton, the Confederate commander, and they had a meeting. It was in one of the houses on Martin Street. We're not sure which one was his headquarters, but it was one of the antebellum homes there on Martin Street, and suggested that they have a cavalry brigade on Grant's headquarters and supply depot. And General Pemberton was eventually convinced that this was an okay thing to do. And so the Texas cavalry and all the other cavalry troops gathered up and left their base, which was out at what is now the Grenada Airport. It was Stretham's Plantation then. And they moved east all the way over to Houston, Mississippi, and then swung north, and then swung around to the area just east of Holly Springs. Holly Springs was where Grant had his supply base. And Mrs. Grant was in Holly Springs at the time. General Grant was not there. Well, there is an old saying in the military, about 10% of the time somebody fails to get the word. Well, Grant knew that Confederate cavalry was loose in North Mississippi, and the 10% that failed to get the word were the guys at Holly Springs.
Uh-oh.
Well, about 5 o'clock in the morning, the Confederate cavalry came roaring into Holly Springs, captured the whole place, routed the Union troops that were there, burned up everything that they didn't steal. And when they rode out of Holly Springs, one of the soldiers said he had on 6 shirts and 5 pistols. The first thing that General Van Dorn ordered when he was the Confederate commander on the raid, first thing that he ordered, though, was a pretty smart thing. He sent one company of troops with strict orders to take all of the whiskey barrels and bust them open and pour them in the streets. He didn't want his troops finding that first. Anyway, it destroyed Grant's supply base, and all of the Union troops that were down in the Oxford Abbeville area now suddenly had to go on half rations. And so the decisive battle for Vicksburg, which supposedly was going to be fought on the Yallabusha River banks, didn't happen. But because the Confederates were having to prepare for all that, there's still an extensive array of Confederate positions here. There are numerous forts that were built around Grenada, some of which are still in existence. You can go see two of them that are on Corps of Engineers property right now, and they've been restored to where you can walk around and look at them and see just what a Confederate fort would have looked like. They were designed by a Major Sam Lockett, who was also responsible for the defenses at Vicksburg. Following the defeat at Holly Springs, the Confederate troops at Grenada, there were about 25,000 of them, just sort of stayed in their camps for a while, but Grant wasn't idle. He then went on the attack down the Mississippi River and eventually landed south of Vicksburg and fought the battles at Raymond and Jackson and then at Vicksburg. So when he launched that aspect of his campaign, they were withdrawn from Grenada and sent down to the defenses at Jackson and Vicksburg. That happened in January and February of 1863. So there were about 25,000 of them in Grenada during that December-January period. Largest population Grenada's ever had.
It's just what I was thinking.
25,000 men here. And then things stayed quiet until after the fall of Vicksburg. After Vicksburg fell, then the Confederates were mostly just cavalry troops and that sort of thing in this area. And the transportation center was still here, though. The railroads, were still functioning. So General Grant ordered some more cavalry raids to come up and destroy the rail lines. There was one column that came down from Memphis and one that came up from Vicksburg. There was only one cavalry regiment defending Grenada at that time. This was in the summer of 1863. And they fought a very brief skirmish with the troops that were coming up from Vicksburg about where Levada plant is located now. And they fired a couple of volleys and then took off for the east. They were heavily outnumbered, and the commander of that Confederate regiment wasn't going to hang around to fight a last-ditch effort against numbers that were about 5-1 against him. And the two Union columns converged on Grenada, but they had conflicting orders. One had been told to burn absolutely everything, and the other had been told, no, just destroy the railroad depot and all the shops and manufacturing supplies. So the group that had been told to destroy everything had gotten started first, and they burned a lot of houses and a lot of businesses, but they had not gotten past the square when the second group arrived and said, no, we've been told just to destroy the railroad and the manufacturing facilities. And so they stopped, and that's why some of the antebellum homes did survive, but they're all west of the square. The railroad and all of its machinery was destroyed completely, and it was over 500 rail cars destroyed in that one raid. After that, Grenada pretty much slipped into obscurity as far as the war was concerned. It moved on to go to other areas. But if you want to see the history of what happened during that critical time, there's still lots of things around Grenada that you can see. Trench lines, the forts. And interestingly, one fort is out just to the east of the elementary school, and the person that owned the property didn't want to damage the fort, but he wanted to build his house on the site, so he built his house inside the fort. It's still there.
Wow.